Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. One of you suggested to me a little while ago that I do a talk on partial Mahler cycles, which actually turned out, I think, to be a super idea because, there are a lot of really good partial Mahler cycles that have been boxed up, and I was able to talk about some of them, and it was really, I think, a valuable opportunity to discuss some fantastic performances, either outside of the complete sets or that perhaps I didn't mention in my surveys of the individual works. There are any number of reasons, convenience, and so I thought to myself, well, golly gee, if I can do Mahler, I might be able to do some other composers too, specifically Beethoven, because there are quite a few really excellent partial Beethoven cycles that have been boxed up. And my criterion for what is a partial Beethoven cycle is not just that a conductor did some Beethoven, any more than it's a conductor did some Mahler, because everybody does some. And usually people do a couple, two, maybe three of them. But what I mean is somebody who was basically headed towards a complete cycle, but for whatever reason, death or some other act of God or intervention prevented them from completing it, leaving us with, a genuinely interesting, viable collection of Beethoven recordings. And I have here 9 because, as you know, there are 9 symphonies. So I figured, what the hell? Let's talk about 9 to start with. There may be some more. I know that there may be a couple others, and there may be some that are sort of betwixt in between. One of the ones that really comes to mind, for example, right away, that I'm going to talk about it because I'm talking about it now, but I don't include in the 9 is Erich Kleiber, because Erich Kleiber he never planned to do a complete cycle. He recorded the Eroica a couple of times. He recorded 5 and 7 and 9. And so you have the makings of a cycle, but they were very much individual releases. And they were only boxed up later in like Erich Kleiber editions. So I think that, that to me doesn't quite qualify. It's on the cusp. But I talked about it, and they're wonderful. We all know they're wonderful. So there you go, if you want to talk about that. But these are all artists who otherwise never did a complete Beethoven cycle. Another one, let me just throw another one out there. Antal. He never did a complete Beethoven cycle for Mercury Living Presence. He did one with the Royal Philharmonic later that was paid for by the orchestra and released on Decca, I think, originally, and now it's out on DG or in some strange CD confabulation. It's out there. But his Mercury Living Presence was always missing the 9th. And so what could we do? It wasn't complete. It just wasn't. So let's talk about the ones that are basically complete and interesting. And we have some very, very major names. I'm going to start by mentioning 2. I don't have the discs here. I do have the discs here, but they're in these mega boxes. And I just didn't feel like getting on a ladder and pulling them down from the shelf. But the 2 of them are 2 of the very greatest conductors of the 20th century with 2 of the very greatest orchestras of the 20th century. And those are Charles Munch and Fritz Reiner, both of whom did substantial Beethoven recordings. Munch did at least, 1, 3, 5, 6, 9, maybe another one. And Reiner did basically all of them, except for, I think he didn't do the 4th, but I think he did all the other ones at one point or another, although the 2nd was on Columbia with Pittsburgh, but you can put it together pretty easily in like that complete Reiner edition, that would be in there. So yes, but what they tell us is something I think very meaningful, which has since become meaningless. That is, that there was a time when doing a Beethoven cycle was a privilege and an honor, and you took your time, and you did these things gradually, and you built up your conception and your cycle, and you did it later in your life, and if you were lucky, you finished it. Nowadays, they just get released in 5-disc sets with all the symphonies at once that have all been done in 15 minutes, and the same conductor might do it again next week. it's become meaningless. And that is part of the general debasement of the value of a recording of classical music. That's why that you can get them for $1.75 for the entire box, which is fabulous for us consumers, but terrible in terms of what it tells us about the value of the music per se. I think it's just awful, frankly. We could do so much better with fewer of them, but we are very happy to have Charles Munch's Beethoven and Fritz Reiner's Beethoven. Both of them in particular offered superb performances of the Ninth. I mean, really extraordinarily fine, and I mean some of the best ones out there. I talked about some of them in my video on the Ninth, and it's very, very clear that they're just great, and that their Beethoven was often inspired. And so those performances are in the big Munch box and the big Reiner box. They're not available separately, at least not as of yet. I mean, they were available on individual budget discs and mid-price discs over the years, some or all of the cycle, but that's 2. But let's talk about the other 7, because I have them all sitting here in their handy-dandy boxes. And I mean, sometimes with other stuff, sometimes just Beethoven. One of the most noteworthy and interesting was Giulini, because Giulini recorded a lot of Beethoven in his day. He did it everywhere. He did it in London, he did it in Los Angeles, but he never actually got to an entire cycle until he jumped ship at the very end of his career, moved to Sony Classical, and did this almost cycle. It's only missing the Ninth, and everything else is here, along with a few overtures. Let's see, Coriolan and Egmont. And these are very slow. And the orchestra is the orchestra of La Scala, which is nobody's idea of one of the world's greatest orchestras in Beethoven, anyway. I mean, it's another story in Verdi and Rossini. I mean, they're a good orchestra. But when Giulini did these, by the time he got to these, he was in his very slow phase. He was quite similar to the late Otto Klemperer in that respect. You know, he got slower and slower and slower. But the thing about Giulini is that he was so intense. He had such integrity as a musician that everybody took him seriously, and deservedly so. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying this isn't the best Beethoven around. But it's got very beautiful moments in various performances. It's a very consistent set. They are pretty consistently slow and pretty consistently sober, but well-realized conceptions of the symphonies. And some people like these performances very much. I happen to enjoy them once in a while. I enjoy them actually for the timbre of the La Scala Orchestra, which is different, and also because of Giulini's sobriety and sincerity, and yes, even sometimes intensity. This is an interesting cycle that collectors will want to hear. I don't recommend all these partial cycles to like normal people who are just looking for a couple of Beethoven cycles to get through the rest of their lives. These are collector's items, and some of them may be in print, some of them may be out of print. You guys have been fantastic at finding these things that I think are out of print. So Giulini on Sony is something to consider. And of course, you'll already have the Munch box and the Reiner box, right? They're not also in print any longer, but you already were smart enough to get them when they came out. And if this is the year 2765, it's probably been reissued a few times, or it's available as a download, or you can get it for about 5 cents, because that's all that classical recordings are worth in the future. The price is only getting lower and lower as the volume of releases gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, anyway, okay, so that's Giulini. Another very interesting cycle, a partial cycle, which has exactly the same works as Giulini, that is, it's only missing the Ninth, is this one. This is Rudolf Barshal on Melodiya. Now, the interesting thing about this cycle is that nobody knows what orchestra he's conducting. It just says Symphony Orchestra on some of these discs and Joint Symphony Orchestra on other discs. That was so typical of Melodiya in the glory days of communism, in this case the 1970s. Now, Barshal is famous for a bunch of things. First of all, he did the arrangements of the Shostakovich quartets as chamber symphonies and conducted them fabulously for Deutsche Grammophon, and not so well in Italy later on. And he also did a completion of Mahler's 10th Symphony, which is rather well known, and a couple of very good Mahler performances, especially the 5th, which was on Laurel Records, of all things. He was one of those conductors who was always very highly respected. He was one of the first guys to do Shostakovich's 14th Symphony. I think he actually conducted the premiere of Shostakovich's 14th Symphony. He founded the Moscow Chamber Orchestra. He was a very, very serious and sometimes inspired musician. His Beethoven is a little bit like Giulini's. It's kind of interesting. I mean, it's zippier in some zippy movements, but it's very sober, very, very serious, somewhat, well, the recording isn't bad. The sonics aren't bad. They really aren't. It's decent stereo, but it's variable from work to work. And some of his tempi are a little bit on the sluggish side. I mean, the 7th I was listening to the other day, and I mean, the first movement really takes its time. It's like 17 minutes with exposition repeat, but the finale is quite zippy. He gets that part. So, it's hard to tell, but he really was a wonderful musician, and hearing his Beethoven on Melodiya is something collectors may want to get. These are expensive. Melodiya is charging like full price for their discs now because they can. Now that they have them back and everything isn't licensed somewhere else, they're trying to make some money. So this may be hard to find. You may not want to pay for it. Maybe you can download it. But I want you to know it exists. Symphonies 1 through 8 with Rudolf Barshal and an orchestra in Russia, whatever orchestra it happens to be. So there's that one. Next. Oh dear, I have to talk about this one. Yes, Celibidache. Well, someone told me it's Celibidache, not Dache or Dache, something like that. Celi, that's the guy. Now, Celi was, of course, insane. He's famous for his Bruckner recordings, which were slower than molasses, but actually quite inspired as often as not. And also some of the other things he did at like excruciatingly slow tempos. They could be marvelous. Things like La Mer. He was the quintessential chord guy. He was interested in vertical sonority, in texture, in balance of textures. Works that work like that operate on that principle, such as Debussy, that's a fabulous example, could be revelatory in his incredibly slow hands, in his late period anyway. Works that do not operate on that principle, works that operate on the principle of counterpoint and movable bass lines and things like that. For example, Beethoven and Haydn and Mozart do not work so well. This has all the Beethoven symphonies except for the first, right? They're all here. I think they're all here. Yes, they're all here except for the first. And they are just dreadful. Oh, they're dreadful in so many ways. They're soggy and slow and turgid. And he keeps, trumpets and drums as muffled as possible, and woodwinds too half the time, and he monkeys about with phrasing, and there are exquisite moments of ensemble balance, but there's no rhythm, and oh my God, these are difficult to listen to. They really are. But I have to tell you, they exist. And it's a partial Beethoven cycle by one of the last of the mad genius conductors. And like all the mad genius conductors, he could be on or he could be off. And in music of the classical period, and especially Germanic music, and that includes Brahms, by the way, he was just awful. Oh my God, he was just awful. He caused a bit of a furor because he said he refused to conduct Mahler. And all I can say is, oh, thank God he refused to conduct Mahler. He did do an amazing recording of Kindertotenlieder with Brigitte Fassbender that's been recorded, that was released, and by the Munich Phil on their own label. And that's pretty fine and very, very slow, but quite wonderful. It's a little different, though, when you're accompanying something than when you are, the prime focus of attention. So the Celi Beethoven is, let's just say, an acquired taste. a very seriously acquired taste. And that's that. Next, now here's a very, very interesting possibility. Joseph Keilberth, Keilberth, German, not Keilberth, American. I had a little fun with my buddy in Munich today over Keilberth, but it's Keilberth. That's his name. Now, Keilberth was known, of course, because he did that fantastic Ring. He was an opera conductor, a wonderful opera conductor. But some of you may recall, back in the day, there was on Telefunken a recording of Beethoven's Seventh with the Berlin Philharmonic. It was one of the earliest Beethoven symphonies released on CD for reasons I have no clue why. And it was with him, and it was awfully good. It was a great Beethoven Seventh, and it had a lustrous reputation. And he did with a bunch of orchestras. He worked with the Bamberg Symphony and the Bavarian State Orchestra and the State Philharmonic of Hamburg, the Philharmonisches Staatsorchester Hamburg. And he did Beethoven with, like most of these groups. He did, let's see, symphonies 1, 2, what's on here, 6, 3, 4, 5, 8, and 7. And once again, he did not do the ninth. What a shame, because it's an almost complete cycle. Again, you get 1 through 8, just like Giulini and just like Barshal. There is no, well, anyway, you know which one there is none. I'm not going to throw the video in again. There's no last one. It's just such a pity. Because Keilberth was a wonderful conductor. He was one of those Kapellmeister German conductors, but in the best sense. That is, he was thoroughly grounded in the Germanic tradition, wonderfully prepared, and part of a school of idiomatic Beethoven conducting, 19th century and 20th century Beethoven conducting. So this is the icon box on Warner that has 22 CDs and all kinds of fun things in it. It's got some wonderful stuff. I just enjoy it because it's Keilberth, pardon me. But the Beethoven is well worth hearing. And so that Seventh is held up really well. It's terrific. So that's nice to have. And it's interesting because I don't think many people think of him or even know that he almost completed a Beethoven cycle. He was almost there. Next, another wonderful partial Beethoven cycle is Hans Rosbaud. German radio must have like millions of these things because every German conductor of the universe worth his salt had to do Beethoven, of course, and quite a bit of it. And, not all of them got to do cycles. Now, Rosbaud did, let's see what we have here, numbers 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 again. And then there's the violin concerto and the triple concerto and the emperor concerto and a big pile of overtures. And, Rosbaud is worth hearing. This is on SWR Classic, by the way, as part of their Hans Rosbaud edition. Rosbaud is always worth hearing. He's worth hearing just because he was one of those guys who, of such intense musicality and intelligence and humility, and everything he did just sounds. Even when it's in crappy sound, even if it's broadcast sound that sometimes, it's mono sometimes, and these are 1953 to 1962. The sound's going to be variable. But some of you have heard his Mahler, because I recommended that very highly, and have gotten back to me in the comments and also privately saying, wow, he was such a hot conductor. And he was. He simply was. He was a genius conductor. And so I think all of his stuff is worth hearing. And his Beethoven is certainly worth hearing as well. It's quite splendid, even though it's not complete. So Rosbaud is worth considering. And this is a dedicated to Beethoven box. You can get the other stuff in the other boxes. Well, that was really nice to know. There are 2 left. 2 left. I love this one. Okay. This one, and this is going to be coming out again soon on Australian Eloquence. Oh, we have something to look forward to. For once, I can tell you it's coming back. Markevitch. Igor Markevitch. Oh, Igor Markevitch was such a great conductor. Almost everything he did was fabulous. He was just a genius. And he did symphonies 1, 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9, as well as, you notice I didn't say the ninth. Oops. Anyway, and a bunch of overtures. And the best ones to get, I mean, some of these are with the Symphony of the Air, which was, the old NBC Symphony, after it was disbanded, and he came in and did some Beethoven concerts. But the ones you really want to hear, that's, I think, the Eroica and the Pastoral Symphony are with the Symphony of the Air. Everything else is with the L'Amoureux Orchestra of Paris. And oh, they play wonderful Beethoven. I've talked about these performances in discussing the individual symphonies. I love his fifth. It's fabulous. I mean, they're all really, really good. But particularly the ones with L'Amoureux, they're just fabulous because nobody played Beethoven like the French played Beethoven, frankly. Especially Beethoven in his populist, militaristic mode. Something French orchestras did very, very well. They play it like the Marseillaise, which is the way you're supposed to play it. It's just wonderful. The finale of the fifth just rocks. It's so extraordinary. And I talked about it. Again, I've talked about the best of these performances in discussing the individual symphonies. But they were at one point boxed up. I think this is like a Japanese thing, possibly. I don't know if it's still available in a box, but it won't matter because all of Markevitch is coming soon from Australian Eloquence, and we are going to want all of Markevitch because Markevitch is one of those conductors you just have to get. His approach was very lean, unsentimental, incredibly rhythmic. He was a genius prodigy as a composer when he was younger, and then he became a fabulous conductor of contemporary music, especially Stravinsky, and he's approaching it from that angle, and it works just fabulously well. He doesn't neglect Beethoven's revolutionary or romantic side or any of those things, but he had the intellectual, penetrating insight of a true musical genius, and his performances reveal that. So Markevich's Beethoven is definitely a partial cycle that if you're into Beethoven, you're going to want to hear this. So you'll just get the DG Markevitch box and you'll be in business. Finally, I have to say, however, the partial cycle that I think deserves the most attention because it has the most unbelievably marvelous performances in it is Fricsay. Now, I've talked about many of these performances individually, and especially his version of the ninth, which is one of the all-time great ones. These are mostly with the Berlin Philharmonic, and some are with the Bavarian State Orchestra. He did symphonies 1, 3, 5, 7, 8, and 9, and also a bunch of overtures. Now, he was supposed to do a complete cycle. This was as far as he got. He passed away of cancer before he could complete his Beethoven cycle. But what he left us is just extraordinary, including like the slowest fifth ever, but it's just so compelling. Fricsay was another one of those genius conductors who just made music. And when you play these performances by people like Markevitch and Fricsay and Munch and Reiner and you listen to the crap that's coming out from people like Theodor Karensis and some of these other people who just whip off Beethoven cycles at the drop of a hat, you realize that the difference was not talent. It wasn't talent. It was humility, number one, seriously humility, and it was understanding what the music meant and how to communicate that by giving a performance that realizes the composer's intention and isn't just making a statement for its own sake. I mean, I don't want to go into it. I don't want to sound like a curmudgeon because there is also wonderful Beethoven happening today. I mean, Paavo Järvi's cycle was fabulous. There is great Beethoven out there, and there's always the possibility of more, always. But what this does tell us is that the incidence of greatness is always going to be a drop in a sea of mediocrity everywhere you go. And that was true in Fricsay's time too. He wasn't the only guy doing Beethoven. Markevitch wasn't the only guy doing Beethoven. Lots of people were doing Beethoven. It wasn't all great. It's not just great because it's older. It's great because these conductors understood a certain style. They were raised in it. It was in their blood, and they were able to communicate their love of this music in this specific repertoire in a way which today's modern conductors don't do so well. They just don't. I mean, they have other gifts and other areas of expertise, and that's fair. We've talked about this before. The classical music world is somewhat cyclical. Things come and go. And it's most obvious in the operatic world. There's a dearth of Wagner singers, but it's an amazing surfeit of fabulous, fabulous Baroque music singers and early music singers, because we have the voices. They've been trained to do it. And it's all going to come full circle. At some point, we'll find that there's a batch of terrific Wagner and Verdi singers or bel cantists, and the Baroque people will, wane a little bit because people's interests will change, and the repertoire is always a little bit fluid, and so it is with orchestral music and with conductors. But I think, hopefully, these 9 partial Beethoven cycles will give you some pointers as to which direction you might want to turn. Or if you happen to already own some of these sets, like the Keilberth box or the Munch box or the Reiner box or any of the Fricsay boxes, or you've got the big boxes, the cubes, or you get the Markevitch box, you may or may not be paying attention to these Beethoven performances because these conductors were known best for other things, and rightly so. But that doesn't mean they couldn't do stunning, stunning work in Beethoven. And so, take those boxes down off your shelves and out of your shelves, pardon me, and give the Beethoven a spin. You may be very, very pleasantly surprised. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me for this discussion of partial Beethoven cycles. Take care.